Here at St. Boniface. Some of you just heard me in the choir as well. It's one of my roles here. Today, this afternoon, I'm taking on one of my other roles, which is co-chair of the Anti-Racism Committee, which was formed in the summer of 2020. It is our pleasure to continue and to revive our speaker series. One of the goals of the Anti-Racism Committee is to provide opportunities to come together and learn and discern about our own history as a Catholic Church and how we have and have not confronted racism in the past, and what we can do as a community moving forward to continue to acknowledge and confront racism as much as possible. So it is our pleasure today to reintroduce, welcome back, Father Mario Powell, who has served liturgy with us many, many times, and we are grateful for that. You have Father Powell's biography, so I'm going to just edit a little bit so we can get right to him. Father Powell became president of Brooklyn Jesuit Prep, a nativity model middle school in East Flatbush, Brooklyn, on July 1st, 2019. Father Powell is an accomplished educator who has taught and worked in both secondary and middle school settings within the Jesuit school system of the Northeast Province. Prior to Brooklyn Jesuit Prep, he was at Regis High School in Manhattan as the director of the REACH program, an educational and leadership program that prepares middle school students from families with financial need to earn scholarships to Regis as well as to other leading high schools in New York City. His success in developing and expanding this program attests to his focus on the importance of quality education in changing the trajectory of the lives of students from migrant and minority families. We have been fortunate to learn from and pray with Father Powell through his years as a celebrant at our Masses. He also led a retreat of the Parish Pastoral Council in 2022. He has written and spoken about confronting racism, including his America article, which you'll see the link for on the page, and we invite you to go back and read that if you have not already. So, thank you again, Father Powell, for being here with us today. We're going to hear from Father Powell, and then we're going to open for questions. Thank you.
It's always awkward listening to a biography of yourself being read shortly before you speak. It truly is a pleasure of mine to be here this morning, this afternoon, and speak on this topic. It is, I am a 41-year-old black man. I am a black priest. I am one of 12 African-American Jesuits in the United States. And I am a black educator. I am, there's some parts of me which is very much the American dream. There's some parts of me that is very much the American conundrum. And for at least a brief few moments, I want to speak to you about my own experience. So this is less of a talk and less of a lecture. I'm certainly not preaching at you. My experience being a black man, a black Jesuit priest, and a black educator. I was very pleased that Father James, during his homily, mentioned that that word or that phrase, to stay awake. To stay awake, that part of our Lenten journey is for us to stay awake. And we spend all of our lives attempting to stay awake so that when the second coming of Jesus arrives, we are not asleep at the wheel. And so I'm always amused when I come across this term, which has now been used in a very pejorative way, woke. And I've been asked, Father, are you woke? And I look at folks a little perplexed because I don't particularly know what they're talking about, because the word woke seems to be a replacement for thinking, for depth, Because as Christians and Catholics, we're all called to stay awake. So we're all called to be woke as Christians and Catholics. Last December, I was raising money. The school I run is in East Flatbush. We don't charge tuition. So my chief job is to raise money. And there are a number of folks who, very out of their generosity, help keep our doors open, who I visit in Naples, Florida, every December. And a friend of a friend of a friend invited me to lunch, which I never say yes to these things, because I've learned over the years that there are enough, I'll use a kind phrase, there are enough interesting people out there that I want to have a relationship with folks certainly before I ask them for money and before I have a meal with them. This one particular person, we are out for lunch, and I described the school to him. We are a predominantly black school in a predominantly black neighborhood. We serve families whose incomes are below $32,000 a year. We serve families who are, I call them refugees from the public school system and from the charter school system, and some from traditional Catholic schools where, for whatever reason, their sons and daughters did not find a good fit. And I told him, I said, our mission is to transform the lives of these young people so that by the time they get to the 8th grade, they will have an opportunity to go to a great Catholic high school. Oh, Father, let me stop you there. This all sounds woke to me. And I looked at him, and over the course of our conversation, he told me, bragged to me that, he goes to Mass every single day. He told me that he reads at Mass. And the juxtaposition between him being an active Catholic, in his words, and then asking me the following question. Your school sounds like you are attempting to save the one pea in a rancid stew. The one pea in a rancid stew. And I looked at him and I smiled. And he continued. He said, where did you get the idea that you would spend so much money, so much of your time on those kids? And I looked at him and I said, maybe in your time going to Mass, you might have heard of a person called Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, who we know saved and focused on the one lost sheep, the one pea in the rancid stew. That is the gospel message at its very heart. And that's who I am as a black educator. All of who I am as an educator is certainly informed by who I am as a black man. I remember a number of years ago, I was driving from Virginia Beach back to New York after celebrating a funeral, and it was getting late in the evening, and a friend of mine, his aunt, who lives on the eastern shore of Maryland, told me, why don't you stop at our house along the way and stay the night? We'll give you the code. Her husband, who happened to be the mayor of the town, looked at me and said, I need to call the police to let them know that you're coming. I just fear the neighbors might call them if they see you arrive at the house. As funny as this is, and perhaps those of folks of color in the audience can certainly relate, this is something that, as a black man, that I've had to get used to. Someone calling ahead so others won't call the police on me. Or those times in which I find myself getting on the subway and I'm not wearing a collar, and the times in which our dear police, NYPD, are not stuck on their cell phones in the subway, and the look I receive. Or the times in which, especially when I don't have a collar on and I'm followed around a store, presumably because someone wants to help me with my shopping, but they're following me around the store because they're afraid perhaps I'm going to steal something. W.E.B. Du Bois has this phrase or this concept of existing under a veil. I am a conundrum, admittedly so. I grew up in Hawaii. I speak, as some people might call, California English. I wear a collar, which gives me power in relationships most of the time when I interact with people. But oftentimes, when people interact with me, they're not interacting with me as a black man with a collar on, or when they do, there's a qualitatively different type of interaction I have with people when they see me with the collar on. They see the power and the prestige, I suppose, that entails. But when it's cold and I wrap a scarf around myself, or when I'm not wearing a collar, that's when that first part of my identity, that is when I become somehow threatening. I become somehow the person where I've seen this, people cross the street when they see me in the evening. I'm probably the most least threatening black person you'll find. As a black man, especially since George Floyd, I've been put in this conundrum of being someone who is judged by the color of my skin, but also someone who is judged not only as a black man, but as a black Jesuit priest. The priestly identity part of me, the identity part of me that grew up in Hawaii, that's the part that makes people feel safe. It's the part that also elicits or gives license sometimes to folks saying the darndest of things around me because they feel safe. For example, I've had people tell me or say around me, those people simply don't raise their children correctly. Or in reference to President Obama, that man just wants his people to get something for free. Or in reference to, I suppose, black people in general, there's a reason why their neighborhoods look that way. And then there's always they catch me. Our eyes meet. And it's always followed up with the phrase, "Oh, we don't mean anything by it. You're different, Father." And I always wonder exactly how I have given them license to say nonsense like that. Last year, I was invited to celebrate a Black History Month celebration at a parish here in Brooklyn, and the parish did a wonderful job, black parishioners and white parishioners alike, in decorating the parish, but also, most importantly, putting up these beautiful signs, placards of black Catholics in the history of the diocese in Brooklyn and black Catholics in general in the United States. They recognize the importance of history, but also celebrating black Catholic history. And in my homily, I said the following. I said that history is a contested space. I'm a former history teacher. History is a contested space. And that if we don't teach our children our history, We are allowing others to define who they are. That's not a particularly offensive or controversial way of looking at history. Well, about a week later, I got a letter in the mail, which I actually thought it was a check, so I got really excited. I opened up the letter, and immediately my eyes gazed to the bottom, and it's CC, the Bishop of Brooklyn, and it's CC to the pastor whose church I was at. Dear Father Powell, how dare you talk about history in such a manner? You should be as far away from kids as possible. Another letter, 3 years ago, I received after the article that I wrote in America Magazine. The article which talked about my identity as a black priest, as a black educator, in which I asked, as the psalmist asked, how long, O Lord? I received a lot of correspondence from folks, 99% of it positive. But this one letter stuck out, in part just for how mean it was. You people, you knew it was going to go downhill after reading that. You people need to better learn how to teach your children to respect the police. This is after George Floyd. If you people, and it kept repeating, if you people did this, you wouldn't have to worry about this. A great formula, if only it were that simple. So as a black man, I'm constantly in a state in which I am privileged. I grew up upper middle class. But at the same time, because of the work that I do, I'm around people that constantly feel safe to say things that are just downright mean. As a black priest, this has not necessarily shielded me within the church. When I remember being at a parish, and I didn't have a collar on, it was hot, and I showed up in a pair of trousers and a collared shirt, and I was sitting in the back of the church about 30 minutes before Mass. Someone came up to me and told me that they weren't giving out food before Mass. And I looked at them and I just gently thanked them. Because what do you do? Or as a black priest walking, my first assignment after ordination was at a predominantly black parish in Harlem. And this is a parish that's surrounded by housing projects. And oftentimes I would go and deliver communion to folks who could not make it to Mass. And these housing projects are filled with wonderful people. They're filled with some bad people, and there's a lot of police. And this was a particular day in which it was hot. I didn't have a collar on. I had the Blessed Sacrament in my hand. And I was stopped coming into this particular housing project by the NYPD because they were looking for a suspect. And I looked at them and I said, so who described the suspect for me? And they said, well, the person's 5'8", black, with short hair. And I looked at them and I said, are you kidding me? To be identified as this general notion of a suspect by the police. I look like the person that they are going to pull over. I look like the person that they are after. I look like the person that just did something to them. It doesn't matter if I'm wearing a collar or not. A black educator. Some of you may have heard me mention this before, but I run a school that has 73 children. Again, we educate kids that come from below the, certainly well below the poverty line here in New York, in Brooklyn, under $32,000 a year. It's in a neighborhood of East Flatbush that the immediate neighborhood around the school it's residential. There's a high rate of black home ownership. But the commercial area of the junction is slightly rough. I have been, with a collar on, offered Hennessy, marijuana, all being preceded with, "Father, do you want some?" But here is the school that it's in its 20th year. I run a school that should not exist. I run a school that, if we are honest with ourselves, this school for 73 mostly black children, mostly poor, should not exist. It exists because of the failure of all of us. The failure of us, of a public school system that leaves too many children behind, of a charter school system that doesn't educate enough kids, of Catholic school system which constantly closes in black and brown neighborhoods. I run a school that should not exist. But yet, oftentimes, I'm patted on the back for the success of this school. Before I went to East Flatbush to run this school, I ran the REACH program at Regis High School. And I had a phrase there that never was particularly popular there, and that was, if I do my job well in the REACH program, it means the REACH program won't exist in 5 or 10 years. It means that we will have attracted enough kids of color to this school that we don't need a program like this. As a black educator, I am aware of the structural problems that exist in education in this country. As a black educator, I'm aware that there are many levels of that dysfunction. And we can discount all of this to say that there are problems with education because we fund our education based upon property taxes. We can say that these problems exist because of there's a failure on our part to have great teachers. I just read this morning that in public schools in the United States, 1.2% of public school teachers in the United States are black men. If we are honest with ourselves, it's not property taxes. It's not a failure of having black men as educators. It's the issue of race in this country. It's the issue of race which is our original sin as Americans, and it's the issue of race that as Catholic Christians we fail to be empathetic with one another. We oftentimes will throw out words such as woke, but in fact, Catholic social teaching makes it very clear. Not only should we be woke, but if woke stands for we feel empathy for someone who's on the margins of society. If woke stands for we have the ability to feel sympathy. If woke stands for we can listen to the stories of others and feel their pain, then as a black educator, I am a woke black educator because I recognize that the issues that exist within our school systems in New York run far deeper than money. It runs as deep as the fact that we find, as a society and as a citizen in New York City, we have found, for some reason, without major uprisings, though a former president apparently wants one on Tuesday, every year, there are black and brown and poor white students right here in New York City that are advanced to the next grade. We call it social advancement, and they are not qualified to do so. Every year we graduate students from the New York City public schools who can't read, who can't write. We receive fifth graders from New York City public schools who can't read and who can't write. Until we as a citizenry are fired up by the lack of our children being educated, nothing's going to change. And I would argue one of the reasons why it can continue is how many of us visit East Flatbush? How many of us know where East Flatbush is? How many of us have talked to a black child? How many of us have listened to the hopes, the dreams of a black kid lately? The issue is not necessarily racism as much as it's racial consciousness. Do we have the wherewithal as Catholics and Christians to be awake so that we can hear the cries of our brothers and sisters who, yes, are within this church and sometimes feel marginalized, sometimes feel that the church doesn't speak to them? Do we have hearts that are not hardened by folks who live in East Flatbush or East New York or Brownsville? I remember when I first moved to Brooklyn, I told someone I was going to Brownsville to go celebrate Mass, and they looked at me like I had two heads. Or I remember dropping off a faculty member who teaches at Brooklyn Jesuit Prep, and someone told me, I dropped him off, it was around 10 o'clock at night, and the person I told looked at me again like I had two heads. How many of us go to these neighborhoods, worship at these Catholic churches? How many of these neighborhoods are bereft from investment, not of economic investment, but they're bereft from an investment of people who actually care? Will people actually care about neighborhoods like these? And so as a 41-year-old black man, as a Jesuit priest, and as a black educator, my number one job is to raise money, but my number two job is to make sure people actually care. They care about the students that we have, the 73 girls and boys that we have on 37th Street. Because ideally, if I'm doing my job right as an educator, I certainly want people's treasure, their money. You don't have to guard your wallets. But I want folks' talents as well. I want folks also to come in and interact with our students, because if we talk about the transformational power of education, we're not just talking about transforming the hearts and minds of these young black children. If we're talking about long-term change in our city and in our country, we're talking about folks like you going to places like BJP and having your hearts and minds transformed as well. Recognizing and meeting little black boys and black girls and recognizing that they have dreams that are both ridiculous and fun, and they're funny, and they play with toys, and not all black boys of this age are threats. Let me leave you with with this story because I don't have a watch on and I have no idea how long I've been. I'm good? Okay. Last year, I have two older brothers. I'm the youngest, and I joke with my father that my oldest brother is a construction worker. My middle brother has had all sorts of issues for his entire life. He's never graduated from high school, certainly didn't go to college. My father supports him financially. I joke with my father that how did he raise these three children? The construction worker, the black sheep in the family, and a priest. Last year, in the spring, my nephew, Terrell, was shot and killed, and just south of Seattle, Washington. Here was a young 13-year-old black boy whose body was riddled with bullets. He was shot with over 20 bullets. 20 times this young boy was shot. And when we were trying to decide about what kind of a funeral that Terrell would have, it was decided it would be an open casket. How many of you know the story of Emmett Till? With Emmett Till in mind, we wanted his friends to be able to come to that funeral and realize that's not what you want to look like. And as we were preparing for this funeral, a threat was made against the funeral. And a long story short, no one came. This child's father was too afraid to come to the funeral. The mother was too afraid to come. None of his friends came. And there I was, as a black Jesuit priest, with the secretary of the funeral home and the director of the funeral home saying prayers over this black body. I bring this story up of my nephew because it's the story of so many black boys throughout this country. This was a 13-year-old black kid. He loved to collect baseball cards. He was looking forward to going to high school. He also had friends who were not good for him. He was at the wrong place at the wrong time. But how many black mothers, black grandmothers have to bury their black children and grandbabies? How many days go by in this city where that happens, and none of us know? When I say that we have a duty, I think a religious duty as Catholic Christians, to stay awake. We have a duty to be able to listen to the cries of the poor. We have a duty to pay attention to the cries of black women, of black grandmothers, of black boys who just want to collect baseball cards, of recognizing that money alone won't solve our problems. Being nice to each other, certainly not what I'm saying, but it's having a heart that is not hardened, having a mind that is, at the very least, open to learning, and having ears that can listen, that we may not know everything about racism. We may not have a solution to racial justice. But to deride racial justice or social justice as somehow anti-Christian, to scoff when folks march and shout Black Lives Matter and saying that is anti-Christian or anti-Catholic. When a phrase like Black Lives Matter couldn't be more Catholic. It points to the very incarnation itself, that our God decided not only that he would become man, that he would become flesh, but in this 2,000 years since the crucifixion of Jesus, that this flesh has developed a black hue. This flesh is a crucified flesh. This flesh is a neglected flesh of a black body, of black boys, of black girls who are neglected, who are forgotten. My job as an educator is to make sure people do not forget these stories, do not forget these hopes, and do not forget these dreams. My hope is these words can help us stay awake, so we won't lose out, we won't forget, we won't walk by these stories, these dreams, and these hopes that can wake us up. Thank you.
Give us a moment to just sit in this left. But we also do want to open this up to conversation. So if you have a question for Father Powell or a question for us to ponder, and I heard someone speak some time ago, and they remind us that questions usually start with a who, what, when, where, why, and end with a question mark. Even though you may also be moved to bring something else up. We've got we've got about 10 minutes, and I want to make sure also that we recognize, and I apologize, I did not recognize the entire anti-racism committee. So those folks who have been meeting with us regularly and participating in our discussions, would you please stand or just wave? We're small but mighty, and we are inclusive and open, and we invite any of you to join us. So that was enough of my little preamble. I'll help facilitate questions if folks have questions. Go ahead, Mike.
Father, how do you negotiate the urban problem of the panhandler whose alcohol you can smell, or whose problem is probably drug-related, who you wonder, are you just perpetuating a problem or actually helping him? We have one here who shows up regularly at Mass.
Yeah, that's obviously that's a huge problem in our city. And can y'all hear me in the back?
No, you're good. You should tell me where to go.
This is for the live stream too, right?
Yes, I forgot about that. I had a young Jesuit who seized me for spiritual direction. Who it was a story that was told, and he was struggling with the same thing. And I told him a story in response that I remember when I was in philosophy studies at St. Louis University, and there were a couple of Jesuit houses right in a row, and we would oftentimes get someone who would knock on the first house, someone would give them something, then they'd go to the next house, not realizing it was all connected in the back, and then they'd go to the third house, and we were all young Jesuit not priests yet, but scholastics, and we were all sort of trying to outdo one another in our charity with these folks that would come by the Jesuit community. And so you'd have, when that knock would happen, you'd have guys that would immediately jump forward and start making sandwiches. You'd have guys that would sit down with folks and engage them in conversation. You'd have guys that would give them bus tokens, and then they'd go to the next house and they'd get the same thing. They go to the next house and get the same thing. And we all felt like we were doing something that was great. And the minister of our house saw this. He was an older Jesuit priest and just shook his head. And I'm not going to answer your question, but I think you'll get an answer with this example. He called the local Jesuit parish, had a big social outreach arm attached to it. And he called the director of their social outreach, this woman, to come. She was a licensed social worker, to come and talk to us. And her talk was basically this: stop it. I know you feel good doing it, but you're not doing anyone any help. I really need you to stop it. And she told us, if you are looking for the folks to have some change in their lives, if they come to you hungry, we've got food. If they need transportation, we can drive them to places, but realize they love getting bus tokens from you guys, meaning the Jesuits, because they trade that in for drugs. And they know that we are a community where they can get bus tokens and they can trade that in. Good intentions on our part. Or how about the example that you use? You are filled with the Holy Spirit, with the beautiful liturgy and music and the preaching, which tells you that you should be opening up your heart to the poor, and you get outside and there's someone who is homeless and drunk asking you for money. What do? I think I go back to this woman who says, in that moment, we're not attempting to change society when we pass someone who is asking for money. But in that moment, we can engage someone in conversation. In that moment, we can not just walk by them. And in that moment, we can at the very least acknowledge their humanity and have their words to us encourage us. We may not give them money, which I know for some of us, we give money every single time. I know there's Jesuit priests that carry dollar bills, and they give money to every single person that they see, or every single person that asks for it. I don't do that. But it does compel me to make sure that I am actively working throughout the week, throughout my life, to make sure folks like that don't have to beg outside of our church. And so it's making sure that I'm involved in doing something to alleviate poverty, to alleviate their own suffering. And it's volunteer, it's donating money to social service agencies that do this and do it on a much larger scale than just giving money. But let me also push back against what I just said. Father Greg Boyle, who is a Jesuit who works with gangs in East LA, and visiting Regis a number of years ago, remarked, he said, we have a lot of homeless in Los Angeles. And he said, don't get me wrong, we have tons of homeless in Los Angeles. We have tent camps in Los Angeles. But no one in LA takes the bus or the subway. We all are in our cars and we just drive by them. He said, when I got to New York and I see all of the homeless in New York, and I see everyone walking by them or getting onto the next car in the subway car, he's like, you literally have to look at them and hear them and walk by. And then he said something that I thought was interesting. He said, these issues won't change until people feel like they can't walk by anymore. He didn't say until you give them money, but he said these issues will not change until our hearts are moved, until the person that we're walking by becomes our brother, our sister, and we wouldn't let our brother and sister sit and beg. Now, what is our response to that? It would be easy for me to give you an answer, and maybe it's the very Jesuitical thing for me not to give you an answer to your question. But I think there's wisdom in what Father Boyle had to say, and there's wisdom in what this social worker had to say, and that is, we are all called to listen, to hear, to be moved, and we're also called, I think, to work for social justice. How we do that, well, I think it's as varied as the many people that are in this church today, but a very good question.
Let's go right here. And I'll try to, there we go.
Oh, thank you.
Repeat the question.
Yes. Thank you, John. Start.
Hi, good morning to you. Good afternoon, really. I met you last year. Every word I listened to you, very much hurtful at times. What is the word meaning, different? I think that every black person that's sitting in here has had that happen, to say we are different. What do we mean by being different? I'm a product of private schools because the Catholic schools would not allow us in. That was back in the 40s and the 50s. My parents took me out of that situation and sent me to Horace Mann, New Lincoln School, where it cost them a fortune. And then ended up in Boston, and it came out to the same words. Well, you're different. What do we mean by being different? Or we don't understand. What does that all mean to us? We still have that today. The unfortunate part of what I am looking at right now is that we live in Clinton Hill. I now see the little Asian girls who are in college, where we used to be able to smile at them, but they cross the street. White people always cross the street on us. They saw a black man on one side of the street and they crossed on the other side of the street. So what does that mean that we are different? I would like you to explain to me what is being different, because I don't understand it. What does different mean? Our color is different. Everybody lays in the sun to get a little brown, but our blood, if we bleed, we're all going to bleed the same color. So you tell me what different means.
I can't answer that question. I think for folks of color, I think especially for folks of color within the church, what is all of what you said, absolutely, I agree, and I've experienced, but it's also the fact that it's not just felt on the outside, it's also felt within the church. And when you are otherized within the church, when you feel this or you've experienced this within the church, it cuts even deeper, right? Because this is supposed to be, that's the body of Christ that we celebrate behind us. But how often folks find it very easy to go from receiving the body of Christ to then going outside of these doors and perpetuating the same racism that many of us can speak to that are sitting here today. And so what makes us different? We could spend an entire evening, an afternoon talking about that. But it's not something that essentially that I can answer. It's the person that's crossing the street. That's the person that has to answer that question. And that's not me. And oftentimes, I'll tell you this, oftentimes I get on the subway and it's a weird moment in which you get on the subway and it might be late at night, and you see that there's someone on the subway that they are afraid of. And some part of me says I don't blame them. But as a black priest, I sit down in that car. I sit down in that car because whoever that person is that has made people afraid doesn't deserve me doing that to them as well. And for most of these folks, they look like me, and it doesn't matter if these folks are crazy and drunk or religious. What makes us different is that we have black skin, and folks are threatened by that. And that's an unfortunate thing. I would love to be able to say to folks that the only time I've seen people leave a subway car or cross the street is because it's been someone who has been threatening. But we all know that's not the truth. People cross the street when they see me. And so what is the issue there? That's something, again, person crossing the street needs to answer.
Thank you, Father. Very good speech today, because many of the things you shared, I have also experienced as a black man. But my question is, I'm just curious as to whether there was a reaction from the bishop when he was CC'd, that letter, a letter of complaint.
That's an excellent question. Before I get to an actual answer, there was a reaction. When I was ordained a priest, the question was, when I had shared the story that someone wrote a letter to complain about a homily that I had given, and they had copied the Bishop of Brooklyn to that letter, excoriating me. And the bishop that ordained me to the priesthood told my ordination class that if you don't have people complaining about you, you're doing something wrong. As young priests, you need to be preaching in such a way where folks are going to complain about you. Now, for the right things, of course. And in this case, both the pastor and the bishop reached out and said that the bishop said, just acknowledged the fact that he had received this and told me, "Father, you were doing wonderful work in East Flatbush. I love the fact that the Jesuits are in Brooklyn, and I love the fact that you are open to preaching throughout the parishes throughout the Diocese of Brooklyn, and that he prays that I continue to do so." I think the message was clear. Look, the bishop wasn't going to condemn this person. I'm not going to condemn this person. The pastor's not going to condemn this person. I wrote a letter back to the person in which I told him that he now has 73 young black children praying for him every single day. Because that's the kind of community that we are. We are a community of prayer, of education, and of transformation. And we don't, it's not our job to get even at folks or even to get angry at folks. It is our job to try to figure out, how can I transform how this person thinks so he can treat the people that I educate like human beings?
Father, thank you for your words today. As a parent, I'm wondering how you as an educator and how educators in general approach giving our children, helping our children and society with a more honest reckoning of the history of race in America, while still instilling them with a sense of hope. There's a lot of emphasis on sort of oppression, and I worry sometimes that our kids are not going to be hopeful enough about their country, about, are we not a different country than we were 30, 40 years ago? How do we keep them hopeful?
That's, everyone hear that question of, the problems that we face are absolute problems, but how do we, as we are called to be as disciples of Jesus Christ, to be a people of hope, especially to young folks. Look, this is not the same country that it was when my grandmother was growing up. My grandmother grew up in the Mississippi River Delta. She was educated through the 3rd grade and then worked the cotton fields. To say that the United States in 2023 is the same country that she was raised in would be very foolish. But I'll answer your story or your question in 2 ways. 2 weeks ago, I went for the very first time to the Smithsonian Museum of African American Culture and History in Washington, D.C. I've been meaning to go for a while now, and I could never get tickets. It's one of the busiest museums in Washington, D.C. But 2 weeks ago, I was down in D.C., of course, raising money, and I had a Saturday afternoon free, and I was able to get in, and it's too crowded, but I was able to get in, and for those of you who have never been to this museum, certainly would encourage you to go. You go downstairs, the building is huge, but you don't realize how big of a building it is until you are actually in it, and you go down 3 stories where you start. And the whole point of that descent is literally you're descending into the earth so the museum can help tell the story of slavery and racism in this country. And as you're rising up those 3 stories, it's not only going in chronological order of it getting to the present time, but I would argue the whole feeling of the museum changes to one of hope, as you've talked about. I will say this, being at that museum, there was stuff upstairs that I wanted to see, and I couldn't do it. The experience is heavy, and it goes to your point. You're bombarded with the history of not only this country, but the history of the transatlantic slave trade. You go from that to, it does a great job of depicting sinful structures that brought black people over to the Americas. And it's just real heavy to sit through and to walk through. And you get some glimmers of hope, certainly when you read about men and women who have fought for not only for freedom of themselves, but freedom of other people. And so there is hope, I think, absolutely interwoven throughout all of this. But I did walk away from this feeling like there was a 1,000-pound weight on my shoulders. And then, I met some friends to go to brunch, and there was a newspaper that was, we were sitting at the bar of this restaurant. There was a newspaper there that was talking about the 15 other states other than Florida are now looking at how they can ban the teaching of racial history in this country, of attempting to whitewash the stories of racial justice that you and I all know from our history. There's, for me, 2 things here. There absolutely has to be a hope-filled future for kids. As an educator, that's part of who I am as a Jesuit educator. We have to be able to instill our kids with a hope-filled future. But at the same time, our present is pretty scary. And I tell our students at BJP that there are people out there in this country who don't want you to learn about your history. There are people out there who actively work against your well-being. There are people that will criticize me for saying that. But I look at what's taking place in terms of what can be taught in public schools in this country, and it doesn't fill me with much hope. But what does fill me with hope is there are any number of folks who are ready to take up the baton to continue the fight to teach history in a way that teaches them about the freedom riders, that teaches our kids about the women who bravely fought, who oftentimes are never mentioned in our history, but women who bravely fought, including white and black nuns, who bravely even told bishops, we don't care if you don't want us to be involved in the civil rights movement, we're going to walk anyway. That these are stories that have to be told, and they have to be folded into our curriculum, because the moment we stop telling history is the moment that we allow ourselves the opportunity to repeat it. And I think the fight right now in education over our stories is a fight that is worth fighting, but it's a fight that we have to, while we acknowledge the fact that we acknowledge the Emmett Tills, we also acknowledge the fact that we have people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Martin Luther King Jr. There's the evil aspect that I feel like we're fighting against, but balanced with this sense of hope. Another thing that gave me hope was I love the fact that there were a bunch of black families at this museum pointing things out to their children, or grandmothers and grandfathers being wheeled, and it was all multi-generation families, and they're supplementing what their grandchildren are seeing and hearing with stories from their own life. And as I was listening in, these were always stories that were talked about stuff that was bad, but always ended on hope. But what also gave me hope in that museum was the number of white people that were there. Because these stories can't just be stories that are told and known by black people. They have to be stories that are considered as much as part of black history being American history, both the positives and negatives. And when we teach our kids to look at the negative part of our history and our present, we're also teaching them about there's no other country, and this is me being a little bit American exceptionalism, there's no other country that can, from one generation to another, go from my grandmother picking cotton to us electing a black president. There's hope that's there, and that hope can't be ignored. But history is a battlefield. History is political, and history will always be politicized with people who don't want to recognize it and want to weaponize it against folks. And it's our job as folks who are educated, as our job as educators and as our job as parents, to expose children to the truth of reality, but also the point, as Father James said, the point towards the light of our future being one filled with hope. And so I think ultimately you have to do both. And it's a hard thing to do, but you have to do both.
We have time for one more question. I saw a hand over here. Martha?
That's okay. Thank you very much for your talk. And, I guess if I have to use it, I will. I just wondered if there is something that parishioners of St. Boniface can do with your school, if there are opportunities for volunteering or tutoring or after-school programs. And I know you're a fundraiser, so I don't want the answer to just me money, but I wondered if there was something of that sort.
I'll slip you that envelope later. And the question was, is there something with my school that parishioners, if so moved, feel like they can do? I go to the three T's, time, talent, and treasure. A school like mine exists and thrives because of folks like you, Many of you have already gotten involved in the school. Some of you have been to our gala, which was on May 24th. But it's time, talent, and treasure. I oftentimes will not just accept money from folks. That money is always going to be met with an invitation to come visit us in East Flatbush, because I do believe in that two-way street of transforming each other. And so certainly we are a school that exists out of the kindness of people's hearts and the largeness of their wallets. And so I'm never going to turn away money in and of itself, but it's always going to be met with an invitation to come see what we do in East Flatbush. But talent, we have a former banker who just moved from Chicago to Brooklyn Heights, who comes in now twice a week and presents to our kids about financial literacy. That's his talent, and he's, as a retired person, that's what he's giving back to us, and we certainly appreciate it. We have a former CFO who comes to us, and he just helps us monitor recess. When he's not traveling the world, he's in our recess yard. And so this is him giving of his time. I don't think it takes much talent to do what he does, but he's giving of his time. We exist based upon all three: time, talent, and treasure. And so if you are looking to be generous of any of those three things, we have a website, brooklynjesuit.org, that you can take a look at. I'm also here, either here or at Assumption, at least twice a month, and celebrating Mass. You can come to me individually and ask me how you can get involved, but brooklynjesuit.org, you can take a look at it. You can come call me. People have emailed from this parish. We've gotten donations from this parish, and so I'm filled with gratitude knowing that this has been a very generous place, that I get a lot out of coming and celebrating Mass with you all, but our kids also benefit from this relationship. But if you would like to do more, certainly look us up, email me, call me, and I'm more than happy to take your time, your talent, and your money.
So you're already thanking Father Powell again. It does my heart good to see so many of us here. It tells me and the committee that we definitely are ready to do more in conversation as a community. I think the juxtaposition of you being here today with today's gospel and readings to remind us that to be Catholic is to be awake, and when folks may question wokeness in the United States right now, as Catholic Christians we have an obligation to remind that being Catholic and Christian is to be woke. So I'm going to take that with me. And we do have some goodies in the back, so we'd love for folks to, stick around a little bit and nosh a little and be an informal conversation. Thank you again for being here this afternoon.